So welcome. This is the final edition of the noon meeting for 2022. It's being hosted by the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And our speaker today is Professor Lara Dugas. We all know Lara because she is the AXA Chair of Non-Communicable Diseases Epidemiology, one of our two endowed chairs from the AXA Foundation. And Lara is a longtime UCT student who completed a PhD here in the early to mid noughts, let's say. Without dating you, and comes from a background of originally nursing and then human physiology and physiological sciences, and is one of a generation of outstanding scientists trained by Professor Tim Noakes, who has gone on to become more contentious in his later years, but is a serious physiologist of note. And Lara's work then sort of matured in a postdoc in an early career phase at Loyola University in the United States. And then she came back to South Africa 2 years ago or so to take up this endowed chair. So we all know in the division and in the department, we're incredibly excited to have her speak today about some of the changing paradigms in the physiology of unhealthy weight or obesity, depending on what you choose to call it. And what the implications of those changing paradigms of physiology are for public health thinking around non-communicable diseases. So Lara, I'll hand over to you. You know the drill. You've done this before. If you go over, you have about 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, that's going to be quick then. But before I start, okay, how many of you, just raise your hand if you've been told that in order to manage the obesity epidemic, or the reason that there's so much obesity in the world is because we are not moving around enough, we're not exercising enough, and if only we would just increase our physical activity, we could get rid of the obesity epidemic. Anyone heard that? You can raise, okay? We've all been fed this, right? Okay, good. So, okay, let's go. Oh, there we go. So just a general outline. I'm just going to introduce you to the concept of energy expenditure, how we measure it, and then these studies in doubly labeled water, and the studies I've actually been involved in, and then how these studies have then contributed to a much larger consortium of doubly labeled water studies, and then what it means now we understand about what happens to our metabolism across our lifespan, and then finally end off with the actual constrained energy expenditure model and the obesity epidemic. Okay, so just to start off, just focus on this side of the right side. So this is your 24-hour daily energy expenditure, and most of our energy expenditure is spent in resting or basal metabolic rate. It's almost like 70% of our total day we're at rest. We're not running around, okay? And then there's this thermic effect of food, and that is approximately 10% of your total daily calories. And the thermic effect of food is the energy that's required to get what we're eating digested and broken down in the gut, and then taken to our onboard energy stores, which is mostly our adipose tissue. And so that's about 10%. And then the last part of your total daily energy expenditure is this activity energy expenditure. And it's interesting because it's the most variable component. We are actually mostly in charge of how much activity we do throughout the day. But on average, it's between 5 to 15% of our total daily energy expenditure. Okay, so on the lower, more sedentary, it's 5%, and then pushing to about 15% in someone who maybe exercises for 45 minutes to an hour every day. And so just think about the time of day and how much time we spend exercising. And what we have been told will sort out the obesity epidemic is to increase our activity energy expenditure so that we can increase the amount of calories we spend in a day, okay? And so this is what we've all been sold, that this is definitely going to take care of the obesity epidemic. We're going to double that energy expenditure and make sure that you're burning up those calories, right? And where did that really come from? Well, that it was kind of a new, not so new, maybe in the 90s is really when this physical activity message took hold. And as I said, I went to Loyola, And they were looking at it differently because they had been doing population measures of physical activity and tracking people's weight and objectively using objective physical activity monitors and trying to give them a handle of, is physical activity enough to prevent weight gain? And by 2013, we were going with the modern epidemiologic transition study in 2,500 people. Every year we were getting measures of objective physical activity. We were tracking body weight every single year. And that was not what we were seeing in the real life, right? And so my mentor, Amy Luke, and my chair, Richard Cooper, wrote this commentary in the Journal of Epidemiology about physical activity does not influence obesity risk. And it's really time that we clarify this public health message. So that was in 2013, the start of 2013. It wasn't received very well. And in fact, Stephen Blair and Gregory Hand and Edward Archer wrote a reply. And they said, this is absolute rubbish. Physical activity is the most important thing to prevent the obesity epidemic. If you scrolled, this was almost hidden into their commentary. They are funded by Coca-Cola. Unlimited, unrestricted grant from Coca-Cola to fund their labs. Oops. My brain exploded. There's my brain exploded. All right. So that was, and in fact, the New York Times picked up on this and did a whole expose on Stephen Blair, James Hill, and Gregory Hyde, who, by the way, is the Dean of the School of Public Health was the Dean at the West Virginia University. Between Stephen Blair and James Hill, they had received $4 million in unrestricted grants from Coca-Cola. The Dean of the School of Public Health had at that point received $1.3 million. And they were driving this message that it is not the diet or the soda you drink. It is because you are lazy and you're not exercising enough. And if only you would start to exercise more, you would be able to lose weight. And James Hill and Stephen Blair are very well known in the exercise physiology world. You may have heard of the Cooper studies that of risk cardiorespiratory fitness and health, and they were the primary investigators behind that work, which was seminal in my field of exercise physiology. And there they were taking money from Coke, and they actually formed the Global Energy Network, which Coca-Cola funded. And that website is now dead, but if you clicked on it, you saw that it came from Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola were driving the website to the Global Energy Network and shifting the blame. So there it is, Coca-Cola helping families get fit, and you see all of these nice images of Coke, and people running and they're exercising, and who sponsors most of the events, of course, is Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and all these companies. So we've been embroiled in this for a very long time. And in fact, that's why METS was started, to really understand what is the role of physical activity in the obesity epidemic. And luckily, by 2016, people were noticing. New York Times, Time Magazine did a whole article on the myth about exercise. Now, I just have to, I forgot to put the slide in, I'm talking. I love exercise. I just run a marathon. Exercise is the most important predictor. It is the #1 predictor of weight maintenance, and cardiorespiratory fitness is the #1 predictor of overall morbidity and mortality. What I'm talking about today is specifically weight related. Okay, so it's just about the obesity epidemic. I love exercise. Okay, so just so you all know that, all right, please. Okay, this is sometimes a difficult lecture to give. Okay, so that is all of the kind of the media stuff that happened, and really what has been happening at this level. But let's go down a bit into what are we actually talking about when we measure energy expenditure. And this goes back all the way to the 1700s, when the world's first calorimeter. Calorimeter is something in which you can measure calories. And Lavoisier and Laplace in 1782, they produced the first calorimeter. And this is a direct calorimeter. You can put an animal in the calorimeter. You surround the chamber with ice, and then you look at the melting rate. And the more heat something gives off, then the faster the melt rate. And so from that, then you can take that back to calculating combustion. So remember, we take in oxygen and we produce CO2 and water. And so once you can take that measure back, so they first figured out that the heat that was released per unit of CO2 produced from combustion, you could take that back to how many calories you are expending. Because we know for every liter of oxygen you consume, you burn a certain amount of calories. That's just chemistry, physiology. So once we figure out, and I know all of you doing the RMRs with the Q&RG, you're measuring oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production so that you can estimate someone's resting metabolic rate. So the first ones were direct calorimetry, and then by the 1800s, they had come up with indirect calorimetry, and this is the first indirect calorimeter, the dog inside. And so these chambers were filled with oxygen, and then there was CO2 extractor on the other side. And as long as the pressure stayed the same, that means the rate at which they were pulling off the CO2 was the same rate as the animal inside the chamber was using the oxygen. Then that was in steady state. They could calculate very accurately what the calories needed for that animal to stay alive. So this was in the 1800s. You were all, well, those of you in Auckland will recognize this is the arm resting metabolic rate, a cosmetic quark, and someone lies under a hood. And you remember you take in oxygen, so oxygen is 20.93%, right? O2, I mean air, and then and 0.04% carbon dioxide. And then you extract this mixed air. And all you're looking at is in that extracted air, how much oxygen did the person use and how much carbon dioxide did they produce. And once you know the liters of oxygen, that's straight calories in, because for every liter of oxygen you consume, you burn a certain amount of calories. And then if we look at the ratio of that carbon dioxide production to oxygen consumption, we can actually tell whether you're burning more fat or more carbohydrates at the time of that measurement. And so that's in essence what we do when we do resting metabolic rates. So we can scale that actually. Oh, and then the other method I need to tell you about is the doubly labeled water method. So this is another indirect way of measuring energy expenditure. So it's basically, if you just focus over here, so imagine this is the human, okay? So remember, we are at least 70% water, right? And we have this natural abundance of deuterium and oxygen 18 in our bodies. Now, so these are specially labeled hydrogen and oxygen atoms. They're stable isotopes. And when you consume them, they mix with our own body water. If I then take a urine sample over the next 10 days and I look for the appearance of these stable isotopes in your urine, I can estimate what your energy expenditure is. So someone who really turns over at a fast rate, they will have more of those deuterium and oxygen 18 chemicals in their urine initially, and then they'll taper off slowly. Whereas someone who just like kind of burns along slowly, they will have a slower decline in those electrons from their body, right? And so if you know the dose that you give the person, you know their body weight, then you can very accurately calculate how much energy they've burned in that 7-day period. And you just divide that by the number of days that you measured them, and you'll get their total daily energy expenditure. And this is really considered the gold standard, because you're dosing them and then you're measuring what the appearance is of those the hydrogen and oxygen in their urine is. And so again, you're calculating expenditure from this combustion. Remember CO2 and the oxygen. So that's the doubly labeled water method in a nutshell. And I really became interested in this work because in the late 90s and early noughts, when I was doing my PhD work, a lot of the research coming out of the US was suggesting that the reason that there was such a high prevalence of obesity in African American women was because they had much lower metabolic rates than white women. And so that the problem with that is, for anyone know what the problem is? When you give a physiological or genetic answer to a prevalence problem where people, one group is coming in with twice the prevalence of obesity. What do you think happens? Anyone? No?
There's nothing.
There's nothing you can do. Exactly. So, oh my goodness, it's your genes. Sorry, you got the short end of the stick, right? You got the metabolic stick. That's not right. And we certainly know it's not right because obesity is multifactorial and certainly the social determinants of health are very important. But once you say, oh no, it's your resting metabolic rate, sorry, then you can't do anything about it. And that's not right, right? So the research coming out of the US was showing, okay, there's some differences in resting metabolic rates. So my PhD supervisor at the time said, well, let's look at this in South African women because we know that Black women in South Africa have twice the prevalence of obesity than white women. So I was like, okay, let's do that. And of course, what I found, so the first thing I did was we built the metabolic chamber. I think I've showed you at UCT. It's now been dismantled. But I started doing metabolic studies, looking at differences between Black and white women. I also looked at validating equations that go into heart rate monitors so that we could use heart rate to estimate calories. So I went into polar heart rate monitors initially so that we can tell people what they're burning on a minute by minute basis. Now everyone has an equation. And this is the data from my study in 40 women, so 20 Black women, 20 white women. And in each group of 20 women, I had 20 normal weight and 20 obese women defined by BMI. And what did you see? So the red dots are the white women and the blue dots are the Black women. Does it look very different? Resting metabolic rates? This is actually total daily energy expenditure. No, I could not account for any differences in metabolic rate using the chamber at UCT. And it was very counter what was coming out of the US. And actually, when I presented this research at the end of 2005, it was at the Obesity Society conference in 2005 when I met Amy Luke, and she was presenting her data that was showing that there were physical activity was not protective of this weight gain, okay? And so we were both coming at it like outsiders where we were finding things that were going against what people were being told, right? And so we got together and I invited her to South Africa and we did a W-level water study in a group of young adults living in Expenditure. And the reason we did that was we were getting ready for the med study. And we wanted to look at how good these monitors were at measuring energy, different levels of energy and physical activity. And so we did a W-level water study where people wore the monitors over the same time period. And we captured, and this is in the women and the men, and these are young, these were between 25 and 35 men and women living in Expenditure. And you can see among the women, over 60% of their day was sedentary by the monitors. Then light activity, this is moderate, and the women get no vigorous physical activity. But then had slightly more vigorous physical activity. But we used the W-level water really to see how accurate these monitors were at capturing the physical activity. The one thing you have to do when you do double-labeled water studies is you still have to measure a resting metabolic rate, okay? Because the double-labeled water method will give you a total number of calories burned, but then you need to measure the resting so that you can take out the resting, and whatever is left then is probably activity energy expenditure, okay? And so that's how we use the W-labeled water method. We found that it was, the monitors were really good at estimating intensity because obviously W-labeled water, it cannot tell you, it will tell you how many calories you spent, but it's not going to tell you how you spent those calories. And so pairing it with a monitor gives you amazing information about the person, right? And so you can see, well, how are you spending? Is it all because you're sitting for the 16 hours or what are you doing? And so that really led to METs, and I've spoken to you a lot about METs already. Everyone knows, yeah, good. And it's just to remind you, in METs, the prevalence of overweight and obesity is very high in the US among the men, and among the women, it's high amongst the South African women and the US women, okay? So we were going in and measuring physical activity, and we also went and we measured total energy expenditure using the doubly labeled water method. And again, what you see, and this is not adjusted for body weight, but this is just raw. Looking at, you can see that there's actually a lot of variability among the 5 sites, right? For looking at total energy expenditure. But you can see that there are very big differences in the prevalence of obesity and overweight. So something is really going on. And then this is really the key slide from the MED study, because this was on the bottom axis is moderate and rigorous physical activity measured. And on the x-axis, it's weight change. And what you're seeing, well, what are you saying? Is there a nice relationship between the amount of weight you gain and your amount of physical activity? And this is 3-year weight. No, the statistician in the room. No, everyone, no, that's right. So it didn't matter whether you did a lot of activity or no activity. It didn't really predict how your weight was changing over time, right? And so that really goes against that message that if you just start to exercise and be more physically active, you will not be obese, right? So along the way, so I'm doing all this work with MEDs, and the best collaborators, honestly, are biomedical anthropologists. And I met this medical anthropologist, Herman Ponce, and he wanted the MED data because he actually had data from the Hasda population in Tanzania. They're known to be the last hunter-gatherer group on Earth, and so they're still going around 5Ks a day, hunting, and very traditional lifestyle. And Herman, when he, as an anthropologist, would go and live with them for a number of months every year. And so his data was also showing that this relationship between all this physical activity and weight was not protected, right? So he came to Amy and he said, could he look at the accelerometry data, because he's finding similar results to her, and he wants to pool all our data, this objective data, to see if we can really understand the obesity epidemic. So that's how I met Herman. Along the way, Herman came and he pulled me aside and he said, I've gotten involved with this crazy group of people. There are 12 people who are going to do this race across America. And the race across America is you run a marathon every day for 140 days, and you start in California at the beach, Huntington Beach, and you run 140 days and you finish in Washington, D.C. Yeah, you're shaking your head. It's nuts, right? Yeah. But Herman was so brilliant because he knew that if you could get hold of these people and get them to agree to do studies along the way, that these natural experiments are the best. That you could try and understand what is going on with energy metabolism and, what happens to your body weight when you run every day a marathon, and, all these kind of things are happening. So the regime that they did was in a week, they ran 6 out of 7 days. So they ran 6 days. There was 1 day off a week. And they did this for 140 days, and it's 3,000 miles. So that's like 7,000 Ks, right? Yeah, 7,000 Ks, they did it. And so they started off with 12. Within a week, 2 had left the group because personalities. And then one woman left the group. She had to stop because she got fractures, obviously. And then there was that group of, so then there was 9, and then they lost 1 more. And then the final group on which we have data is 5. And they agreed to let us do doubly labeled water along the route, okay? And so we all flew to Los Angeles, and we got them into the lab, and I did BIA, and I did resting metabolic rates, and then they did their doubly labeled water, and then we met them again in North Carolina, which was like the end of the end trip, and we repeated all those measurements, and then they finished in DC. And this is the leader of the group, I would say, Bryce Clausen, and he actually was at the university with Herman, which is how Herman discovered that they were going to do all of this. And Bryce then opened it up, actually not just to us, but to a whole bunch of different scientists, immune functions, gut microbiome. There were strength tests. They did a whole bunch of things on these athletes. So this is just to show you, this is when I met them in North Carolina. By the way, when I met them in California, like it was just like, there was so much energy and everyone was excited, and they knew it was an amazing thing that they were doing. Well, this is when I met them in North Carolina. You can see I've got 2 forest gumps over here. And this is measuring resting metabolic rate early in the morning. This is their doubly labeled water urine containers. So we just use milk jugs and we would get the urine. I went out to dinner with them. They ate like 2 dinners. So when they would order, they got 2 plates. And I hired a van to get to the remote place where they were. And so I got a van that I knew I could put all the seats down. And then I used that as my resting metabolic rate lab. Okay, so they were amazing. They let us do a ton of different measurements. This is like when I got there on the day that I was doing all my measurements, it was really, so they had to take their tents and everything with them. This race is amazing because it's sanctioned by USA Track and Field. And so it's certified races, but they are camping every day for these 4 months, basically. And they carry like their chairs. They all had lounges. So by the time I met them in North Carolina, you could see that if they weren't running, they were lying down. It was very clear. And then this is the data we actually got. So if you just focus on this figure first, figure A. This is a log of days looking at different activities that have used doubly labeled water to measure energy expenditure. And it's been put into a logarithmic scale because some events are like 500 meters run, right? And so we want to put that run next to events like this that take 4 months, right? And so this is metabolic scope. So how many times your metabolic rate? So if I'm just sitting, that's 1 times your metabolic rate. If you're sprinting very hard, like the 400 meters, then your metabolic rate is 50, at that point is 15 times that of your basal metabolic rate. And so you see, as the days go out, the activity comes down in terms of the rate of your metabolic rate, obviously. So the longer the event, it's impossible to sustain your metabolic rate at that intensity when you run the 400 meters to when you're doing a 3-day or a 4-month event. So when we look at the data, we see your measured metabolic rate comes down to, by the way, this is habitual. So it comes down to almost within line of your habitual resting metabolic rate when you aren't doing that crazy activity. So the green is the Tour de France cyclists. They had data from Arctic trekking, the race across America people with the black line, and then people who are pregnant and lactating on the yellow line. Now what you see is as time goes on, the intensity at which we are work, our metabolic rate comes down to that habitual level because it is impossible to keep like exercising at a very high intensity. So this is one of the first studies that we started using for the constrained energy expenditure model. And what was really neat was because everything is measured and we're measuring muscle mass and fat mass, muscle is your metabolically active tissue. So if I measure your muscle mass, I can tell you very accurately how many calories you're burning. So based on their body composition, we could see what their predicted metabolic rate should have been, and then the actual measured metabolic rates using the doubly labeled water. So this is at pre-race when we were in California. Obviously, there was no run. And then this is by week 1 when they started running, and then the final week. So this is now 4 months after the run. And you can see, so during the first week, there wasn't much difference between what we expected and what we observed. By the final week, there was a big difference in what we expected based on their body composition and what we actually measured, right? And so the difference between the expected and observed by that final week was the deficit was very high. Like their metabolic rate should have been much higher than what we actually observed, okay? So that really feeds into what we're gonna talk about. But this is just to show you, by the way, that when these people, they're a little bit crazy, you know. Bryce, right after finishing the race across America, within a year, he rode solo across the Atlantic Ocean from North America to the UK, capsized multiple times in his little boat. But there he is finishing, and now he's married with a child. I'm very happy to report. So, Brian, but he's wonderful. So then I, at this point, was working quite nicely with Herman, and he had a postdoc. And his postdoc was Sam Erlacher. And Sam had managed to get together with the Shwa, an Amazonian tribe, and the Shwa. And so they're interesting in and of themselves. So this is the tribe that does the shrunken skulls. Have you seen? Go Google the shrunken skulls. So, by the way, having an anthropologist round to dinner is just fantastic if you've got small kids and they talk about the shrunken skulls and you see the boys' eyes go, wow, you know. So, but Sam was doing very similar work again to what we were all doing. He was in this tribe and they had two locations. They had the town or the village, which was seen as urban, and then they had people actually living in the jungle. And he went in and he was focused on the kids because the Shwa tribe are notorious for having kids that are very stunted. Okay, and what is the cause of the stunting? So he used double-labeled water, and so he took my resting metabolic rate machine from Chicago up a river. He had to row for 5 hours in a dugout tree, you know, the dugout canoes to get the resting metabolic rate up to the community, and then he had to use a satellite phone to phone me because it wouldn't work initially, and it took a couple of days of troubleshooting before we realized that it was so humid in the jungle that we needed to we needed to change the way that we extract all the air, the water, you know, the humidifier. From the air so that we get proper measures. So once we got that up and running and problem solved, then Sam went in and he did RMRs on over 40 children, 20 of which were in this village and then 20 that were living in the jungle to try and get an understanding of why these kids are so stunted. And so when you think about it, we've got this additive model, which is the one that I spoke to, right? And we've all been sold. If you just increase your activity energy expenditure, you would be normal weight. So because, the one thing I forgot to tell you is that W-leveled water, the technique has not changed since the 1980s when it was formulated for use in humans, because you have to drink the stable isotopes, you have to measure them either in urine or in blood, and all you're measuring is CO2 production. And so it's not like where we come up with new models of resting metabolic rate machines and we're worried that they're not comparable. When you do a double-labeled water study, whether it was in the first one in 1981 or the ones that we're doing, we can directly compare that data because you cannot change the technique. So Sam got double-labeled water data from the kids who lived in the UK and the US and could compare it to the Shwa kids. And so what he observed is that amongst the kids, so the red is the activity and energy expenditure, the black is the resting metabolic rate, and then the thermic effect of food obviously is standard, okay? And what he saw in the Shwa kids is that their resting metabolic rates were much higher than that of kids living in the US and UK who actually did more physical activity than these kids living in the Amazon. And what is happening is that these kids are they have so many infections, and they have a high viral load. And immune function is a really big component of your resting metabolic rate. And so these kids are constantly fighting infections. And in fact, this was the model. So the green is actually immune function. And it's a large proportion of their resting metabolic rate, right? And so what it's saying is that we don't have this amazing, incredible ability to keep increasing our metabolic rates. We have, everyone in this room, you all have a bucket of calories that you've been given. And how you spend your bucket of calories is entirely up to you and what you're doing during the day, and whether you're fighting an infection or whatever is going on. So I use a lot of my bucket of calories to run most days, right? But if I get sick, I need to take some of those calories and give it to my resting metabolic rate because my immune system needs to fight that infection, right? And so it's constrained. We don't have this ability to keep increasing our metabolic rates according to what we are doing. It's limited. You have a bucket, you have a bucket, everyone has this bucket. And how you use your bucket of calories is very dependent on what is going on in your environment. And so this is actually the data from resting metabolic rate and then fat-free mass. Remember, fat-free mass is your metabolically active tissue, right? And what we see for resting metabolic rate is the Schwa kids have a much higher resting metabolic rate for their given fat-free mass because their immune function is so high. And similarly, this is the activity energy expenditure. When you look at their measured activity energy expenditure, you see that it's lower for what is expected based on their muscle mass because their bucket of calories is being consumed by that much higher metabolic rates. And actually then, if you were just to do total energy expenditure, it would look like that it wasn't actually different to kids who lived in high income countries, right? The line actually falls directly over, but that you don't actually get the full picture without measuring the activity energy expenditure. And we did accelerometry with the resting metabolic rate. So then the whole of the metabolic world actually blew up in 2021 and it was all during COVID actually. All of a sudden, everyone was talking about metabolism. And even you go onto the Colbert Show and the blog I follow every day, Conscious Health, their headline was exercise in, exercise out, energy sideways. And New York Times did a massive piece on what we know about metabolism may have been wrong. And the reason is that we published, the WA World Water Consortium had just published our first paper in Science, and it had been so well received that even all these media organizations had kind of jumped onto what the message was. And so what was happening, well, first, the WA World Water database was started by 5 scientists, including Amy Luke, who I went to work with at Loyola. And she did her PhD training actually in the W-level water method. And so it was great because I'd come with a resting metabolic rate background. She had a W-level water background, and then we could do all these nice studies together. And because remember, this technique hasn't changed, but it will never change because it is what it is. We're measuring deuterium and oxygen 18, right? They went back to 1981. And they got all the studies. They approached every single investigator who had ever done a W-level water study and said, hey, don't you want to pool your data? And we could then, it's so powerful. And they did. And so at the time I put this slide together, there were 32 countries, 362 studies, over 7,500 participants data sitting in the database. And the age was, because it's safe, these are stable isotopes, you could give them to pregnant women, you can give them to babies. And so there were under 5s, there were people over 65, the majority were between 18 and 65. I'm proud to say that the majority, 95% of the data out of Africa came from our MATE study. And so we had 375 people who we did W-level water in from our 5 countries. So, and that is very important because just like genetics, the databases are made up mostly of US and UK participants, and we need to get African participants' data into these databases that are informing public health policies. Okay. Well, the WA World Water Database was formed in around 2018, 19, and then the first big publication was in 2021. And it really focused on our energy expenditure across our lifespan. And so all of us, you know, when we opened up our textbooks in high school and university, these are kind of the things that you are fed, you know, as to how your resting metabolic rate changes from when you are born to when you die. And so when we are born, we know that babies have a very sharp increase in their resting metabolic rate because they're growing, right? And then that'll continue, you know, it was thought to about, you know, here you go, like this. this is what it was thought, that it was like by the time you're 10 and 11, it's actually dropping off. And then actually some textbooks will tell you around menopause or middle age, there's again a dropping off because people anecdotally see the middle age spread, right? And so that must be because our metabolic rates are slowing down. Well, actually, what we found in the paper, so Herman was the first author, and he looked at daily energy expenditure through the life course. And this is from 7,500 data points. And just this is really the take-home slide. And what it shows is that when you are born, you have this massive increase in your metabolic rate that then peaks only around 20, which makes sense because our bodies, for the most part, are still growing. In fact, men can still have growth spurts and grow until around into their early 20s. At that point, there's a nice leveling off of your metabolic rate until 60, when only at that point it starts to decline. And physiologically, that makes so much sense because if you think about telomere shortening, the whole aging process happens much later, right? And so when your body is slowing down on that growth and repair, then you will start to get a decrease in that metabolic rate. Remember, we're losing muscle, but it happens much later than what we initially thought. People thought it was all happening around 50 with the whole, the middle age spread. And so this was the take home. Using the double leveled water, you could see that there's this massive increase, leveling to about 20, then nice and constant, and then falling off from when you're in your 60s. And they could look at pregnancy, and it was always thought that pregnancy was a time of like a big spike in your metabolic rate. But what they found is actually, so this is the adjusted total energy expended and basal metabolic rate, and you can see this is pre-pregnancy, first, second, third, and post-pregnancy. And there's really not much difference in your metabolic rate because your fat-free mass is what is driving your metabolic rate. So as long as you account for that fat-free mass, you will see that there is a pretty even, a pretty constant metabolic rate. So that was really the first paper that came out of the database. And then this paper was really focused specifically on this constrained model of energy expenditure. So I've already showed you this is the current model, and then the people that want you to be exercising more, that is the additive model, right? And I'm not going to talk about this performance model. I'm going to talk about the compensation model. So if we're going to beat the obesity epidemic by just making people increase their activity and energy expenditure, they'll increase the amount of calories they're expending, and then they'll lose weight, right? And that's what we've been sold. Instead, the compensation model, which is now where we've landed with all of our data, says that you've got your resting metabolic rate and your activity energy expenditure. When you start to increase that activity energy expenditure, because each of us has a bucket of calories, you're going to be taking away from one of the other energy expenditures that get you through your 24-hour energy expenditure, okay? And so what did they actually find? So what they found is that, well, first of all, this is looking at your total energy expenditure against your resting energy expenditure. And if there was like a one-to-one, there would be this solid line. And in fact, what we see, it's a dotted line. And so it's not, you can't just keep increasing your activity energy expenditure and think that your activity energy expenditure and that your resting metabolic rate will move with it. It doesn't work like that. And in fact, I want to say sadly, what they found is that when you arrange people by BMI, you find that the people with higher BMIs actually dive more into that bucket of resting metabolic rate calories than people who are normal weight, okay? So the higher your adiposity, when you start to do more activity, you take away more from your resting metabolic rate, okay? That's very important. So we saw that in our runners who raced across America. We expected, based on their body composition, that they would have a certain 24-hour metabolic rate. And what we observed was it was much lower, right? And so they weren't able to keep increasing their metabolic rate. They were needing energy to do repair. They were needing immune function energy, right? And so the take-home message of that paper really was one, that when you increase the sort of these long-term increases in activity energy expenditure do not result in an increase, one-to-one increase in your total energy expenditure. That often when you increase your activity, and this is extreme activity, you're going to depress your resting metabolic rate, and that those differences don't seem to be affected by gender, but they do seem to be affected by adiposity, in that people who have a higher BMI can lose up to 50% of their predicted resting metabolic rate. That is a lot of calories that's been shifted, right? And so the summary, calories burned by increased activity do not lead to this increased total energy expenditure as we had previously thought. And it's very important. People with adiposity may struggle more to lose weight when they start exercising than people who are normal weight. And what do? We tell obese people, you got to exercise. And then we see that they don't get the weight loss that they deserve, right? And then we say exercise harder and they exercise harder. And all they're doing is they are clamping down on their metabolic rate. Okay, and this is just data from Amy actually published looking at anorexics and people who are semi-starved. And this is really on the other end of the scale. We know that when you're not eating enough calories, so whether it's because your calories is not enough to maintain your bucket, there's a depression in your resting metabolic rate. And so if you have, when we measure fat-free mass, and resting metabolic rate, the data should fall over here. But you find in people with anorexia nervosa or who are semi-starved that they fall below the line. So for their muscle mass, their resting metabolic rates are much lower. So whether that physiological insult is because you're doing way too much activity or you're not getting enough calories, the result is the same. You're going to depress your metabolic rate. So and then the last stuff is what has happened in a real world situation. So I don't know if the Biggest Loser came, I don't know if it was in South Africa. Did you know about the Biggest Loser? So it was this television show, and it went on for a number of seasons in the US where they had these people who were morbidly obese. And so BMIs at least in the 40s to like the 60s. And they would come in for a season, which is like about 3 months, and they would do these crazy exercise regimes, and they would be put on very low calorie diets, which are about less than 800 calories a day, okay? And so the exercise was 4 to 5 hours. And in the last season, the producers agreed to let scientists come in and actually do physiological measures on these people. And so this was a study that looked at people that either had gastric bypass, so Roux-Y gastric bypass surgery, or did the Biggest Loser competition. And this is change in fat mass and fat-free mass. And you can see now, so fat-free mass is, you don't want to do anything that takes away from your fat-free mass, because I've been telling you that fat-free mass is your main predictor of your metabolic rate, right? So if you lose fat-free mass, that's not great. So after this, they were followed. So the Biggest Loser, remember, 4.5 hours of exercise every day, and eating at 70% of their resting metabolic rate. And the gastric bypass people, obviously their calories went down. And this was after 12 months, the people who had the gastric bypass surgery had preserved much more of their fat-free mass than the Biggest Loser contestants. They found that this is in terms of their metabolic adaptation. This is the gastric bypass participants. So they initially, when they started, they had their gastric bypass surgery, they had a depression in their metabolic rate, but by 12 months, they had bounced back right back. The Biggest Loser participants were severely depressed in their resting metabolic rates. And in fact, they were followed for 6 years afterwards. And what they found, so 6 years after the Biggest Loser, So they found that their metabolic adaptation at 6 years was still severely depressed, okay? So that insult, that physiological insult of that 4.5 hours of activity and only eating 800 calories just completely clamped down on their metabolic rates. And so I always end, Herman has put all of this story really, into a book that came out. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for some summer reading with the holidays coming up, to read Herman's book. And he talks about the race across America. He talks about the Hasters, and just how he really he coined this constrained energy expenditure model, and how it's right. We're fighting still a little bit with a lot of scientists about, can you solve the obesity epidemic with just increasing calories? Okay, that's it.
Wonderful, Laura, thank you very much. A whirlwind tour with Laura's typical energy and enthusiasm, and passion for an incredibly important topic. So we probably only have about 5 minutes, a little bit more than 5 minutes left for questions. So let's open up for questions. We have Alex, Pindi, and Ms. Munch.
Okay, Alex.
I'm sure the question on everyone's mind is then how do we lose weight?
Slowly, yeah. And people, especially for people who come in with morbid obesity, we start them off walking. We don't make them go and do these high interval training classes and things that are just crazy, because their weight loss will not be what they should be getting, because they will depress their metabolic rates. So we do it slowly. And that's frustrating because people don't want to, they want now. Yeah.
Instant results. Pindi.
Wouldn't exercising build more fat-free mass and in return increase?
To a degree. So what we actually find, and it's very calorie dependent. So as soon as you put your body into a negative energy balance, then if it's too severe, you will break down fat-free mass for energy. So we know that. And one of the best ways to build fat-free mass is you have to actually do resistance training. So it depends about what you're eating, are you in energy balance, and the kinds of exercise that you're doing. But certainly exercising while losing weight is very helpful because it should preserve some of the fat-free mass.
Interesting, but starving yourself to lose weight is totally counterproductive.
No, you cannot. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What's good?
No, thanks for the presentation. I think the one question I have would be, what is your recommendation for how we address the global, obesity epidemic from a public health policy position?
Oh, that's easy. Well, we have to change the way we eat, and we have to change advertising, and we have to get rid of ultra processed food. If I could, I'd get rid of soda and just make everyone drink water. That's very easy. And in fact, did the soda tax win here? No, it's lost. Okay, there we go. So, and because in the US, it also, in Chicago, the city voted against the soda tax because it would be unfair for the poor people who were on the supplemental food program, because that's what they buy. And so they turned it into an issue of racism as opposed to health, right? Yeah.
So South Africa has a sugar tax, but the concept of a sugar sweetened beverage tax separate from that is not taken off here for many of the same reasons.
Yes.
It's a very powerful lobby. Tennessee with
Great talk, Lara. So you mean to tell me if I go to gym at 6 in the morning and take this
Yeah,
day
you have to. Yes.
throughout the day,
Very important.
does it make a difference?
Yes, 100%. I mean, I'm talking about more on the extreme end.
Okay.
You have a bucket of calories you've been given, and it is normal that some of that will be given to activity, to immune function. You're not sick all the time, so you don't need those calories all the time, right? So you should be exercising every day because cardiorespiratory fitness is very important. Yes.
So it doesn't matter if I take the stairs or the lift.
No, it matters a lot.
Hello.
I forgot your name, I just met you. Kefwi, and then we'll go online. Kefwi, go ahead, and then we'll go online.
Yes, I'm just wondering about in terms of like having lower metabolic rates and how that, because there are some kind of survival advantage to that. For example,
Maybe
like,
small animals.
well, no, in terms of like, I'm wondering about, the comment you made about heart rate, for example, athletes tend to have lower heart rates. And so is there less heart rate variability? So is maybe potentially one of the benefits of the exercise being to kind of regulate?
No, so exercise, it strengthens our heart, right? And so it goes without saying, people with higher cardiorespiratory fitness have overall higher morbidity, lower morbidity and mortality. So exercise is very important. You just need one exercise session to change the glucose transporters in your muscles, which help assist with glucose and insulin sensitivity. There is no debate about the role of exercise, but exercise being pitched as the way they're going to solve the obesity epidemic is not right. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to put a pause on questions in the room because we have 2 questions online. I apologize. First, in order, Maylene and then Steve. Maylene, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Lara. I think you've kind of answered my question already. It's somewhat linked to Ms. Emil's, and that was to ask how would we then amend our messages to the public around the pandemic of NCDs, overweight and obesity, but I think you've addressed it already, unless there's something else that you wish to add.
Yes, so 2 weeks ago, I was at the Obesity Society and I chaired a session on environmental determinants of obesity. And in my session was Simone Becerra from Mexico, Ministry of Health. And he's an incredible person who has lobbied against the soda industry to the almost the detriment of his family, with all the gangs and like kidnappings. So he has stood up to the soda industry and actually the ultra processed industry, as well as the media and the advertising. Now, if you go to Mexico, there are no cartoons on the boxes of cereal. There is no advertising of junk food during the hours that children watch TV. And he has single-handedly taken on the industries, and we have to do that.
Good. So we've done tobacco, we're doing alcohol. Next up is sugar. Wonderful. It's appropriate. Steve, final question.
Yeah, it's a comment, Lara. Thanks for a fantastic presentation. I just want to say that the results like this could be misinterpreted in the media. If we're talking about public health messaging, I think it's really important that you emphasize equally the benefits of the cardiovascular benefits of exercise, as well as don't expect it to exercise to reduce your BMI, because I think it could be misinterpreted as, okay, don't even bother about exercise.
Right, which is why the whole time during the talk I just said how much I love exercise and how important it is, that it is the main predictor of reduced morbidity and mortality.
Yeah.
There's no debate about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. We are breathless and we're at the end of our hour. So let us say thank you to Lara. Lara's in our department. She's one of us. And so this is not the end of the conversation, but it's sort of the next step of the conversation. But I can fully imagine convening more and developing more inertia around understanding how we message this from a public health perspective, how we engage with our municipal and provincial partners around what is wellness and so forth as we go forward. So Lara, thank you again. Thank you to everyone online and thank you to everyone in the audience. And this is the last new meeting of the year. So have a fabulous end of the year. We'll see you in 2023. Enjoy.